we're pleased to be invited to speak today. We have a presentation that is about 45 minutes long, and then we're happy to open up for questions. I will speak first on measures that Health Canada has taken to fast-track the approval of medical devices related to the coronavirus. We're pretty excited on this call because we just received good news that one of our clients working with a manufacturer in Wuhan got approval from Health Canada to import and sell a COVID medical device under the fast-track process, which we'll get into a bit later. Anna will speak about measures that Health Canada has taken to fast-track the approval of sanitizers and disinfectants. And then Amanda will speak on privacy implications of various initiatives related to coronavirus, such as contact tracing and Ontario's Panther database of COVID-19 patients for scientific research. So let me begin first with medical devices. First slide, please, Bridget. So we've all seen headlines like this concerning the shortage of personal protective equipment, especially for healthcare workers, which has been very troubling. Personal protective equipment, or PPE, includes things like the N95 masks that we hear so much about, face shields, gloves, gowns, and hair and boot covers. Slide, please. We've also seen headlines like this concerning the need for COVID test kits. The common wisdom is that the economy can really only open up if there's mass testing of the population, so that those who test positive can isolate, and those in contact with those who test positive can be traced and similarly tested and told to isolate if positive. Now, both of these headlines concern products that are regulated in Canada as medical devices. And Health Canada has taken steps to fast-track the approval of medical devices for sale and importation into Canada. But before we turn to what Canada is doing to fast-track the authorization, I thought we would first look at how they are regulated generally under normal circumstances. Slide, please. So let's begin with the definition of a medical device. And the definition of a device is found in Section 2 of the Food and Drugs Act. And in general terms, a device covers a wide range of instruments used in the treatment, mitigation, diagnosis, or prevention of a disease or abnormal physical state. It also covers any article used to restore or modify or correct the functioning of any body part. The definition of a device does not include products that work on the body through pharmacological, immunological, metabolic, or chemical means. Rather, these products are regulated as drugs or biologics or natural health products. Next slide, please. In Canada, medical devices are regulated by the Medical Devices Directorate, which is an agency within Health Canada. The two pieces of legislation governing devices are the Food and Drugs Act and the Medical Devices Regulations. And then as well, there are numerous guidelines that set out how the Directorate interprets, applies, and enforces the law. The Medical Devices Directorate is responsible for monitoring and evaluating the safety, efficacy, and quality of medical devices. And it does this through a combination of three steps. The first is pre-market approval or licensing of the devices themselves, or the businesses that work within the device field. The second is through post-market surveillance. So after a device is approved for importation or sale in Canada, there is a system of mandatory problem reporting, mandatory recall procedures, and complaint handling. And then the third step is requiring quality systems in the manufacturing process. This means that facilities that make or import medical devices have to meet certain safety or quality assurance standards. Next slide, please. The medical devices regulations are designed so that the level of oversight is commensurate with the risk presented by the device. Devices are classified into 4 different classes according to a set of rules set out in Schedule 1 of the regulations. Those rules determine how a device is classified. Class 1 represents the lowest risk, and Class 4 represents the highest risk. Next slide, please. The classification rules are based on a number of risk factors posed by the device. So for example, the rules ask, what's the degree of invasiveness of the device? Does it come into contact with the surface of the eye, or does it penetrate the body either through a body orifice or through the surface of the body? What's the duration of contact? Is it short-term or is it long-term? Long-term is defined as 30 or more days of continuous use. The rules ask, what is the body system that is affected? And then finally, are there effects on the are the effects on the body local, or are they systemic? Next slide, please. Manufacturers of devices are required to take all of the classification rules into consideration when establishing the proper classification for any given device. And it's possible that a device could fall under more than one classification rule. However, if that's the case, then final classification is determined by the rule that assigns the highest level of risk. And then if there's a discrepancy between the manufacturer and the Medical Devices Directorate regarding classification, the final decision rests with the Directorate. Next slide, please. So this is just a schematic that's found in one of the guidelines, and it shows how to apply the classification rules to come up with the appropriate classification. And we wanted to give you some examples of devices and how they're classified. Next slide, please. So recall that class 1 cover instruments with the lowest hazard of risk from use. So these would be things like bandages, toothbrushes, and tongue suppressors. Class 2 is then next on the continuum of risk, and it includes things like, next slide please, Bridget, digital thermometers, sterile bags, and tubing. And the next slide is class 3 devices, which you can see there's this continuum of invasiveness. These class 3 devices are things like blood glucose monitors and oxygenation systems. Next slide. And then the next slide. And then class 4, presenting the highest risk, are things like catheters and breast implants. Sorry, Brigitte, we're going to want to go back a bit. Sorry, guys, I'm not. Bridget, you want me to keep going, or do you want to organize?
Yeah, just 1 second. I'm just going back. So just 1 sec. Okay, I just need to, my apologies there, folks.
No worries at all.
Yeah, sorry, it just kind of flipped through. Which
It's okay.
Sorry, it flipped through right too fast for me. So
there we go. That's perfect. That's the one.
Sorry. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Okay. There you go. I'm sorry.
No worries at all.
Forgive me, folks.
Yeah, that's totally fine. So there are a number of persons associated with medical devices, and the type of activity that each person performs dictates the type of authorization or license that you need from the Directorate. A manufacturer is defined as the person who's responsible for, as it sounds, designing or making or assembling the device, and who sells a medical device under his own trademark or trade name. A distributor is the person who sells a medical device in Canada. It can include a person outside of Canada who sells a device into Canada. And an importer is the person in Canada, other than the manufacturer, who is responsible for a medical device being brought into Canada for sale. Next slide. So Health Canada issues 2 types of licenses. The first type of license is the medical device license, or MDL. And this is the license that's issued for the device itself. All class 2, class 3, or class 4 devices must have MDLs. This means that manufacturers of these class of devices must obtain licenses prior to selling or importing into Canada. Class 1 devices like the toothbrush or tongue suppressors do not require an MDL. Rather, Class 1 medical devices are monitored by Health Canada through the second type of license, which is called the Medical Device Establishment License. Next slide, please. The Medical Device Establishment License, or MDEL, is issued to a quote-unquote establishment, meaning the business or person who manufactures, imports, or distributes medical devices, whatever the case may be. So an MDEL is required by manufacturers of Class 1 devices. An MDEL is also required by importers or distributors of all 4 classes of devices. Next slide, please. There are some entities or establishments that are exempt from the need for an MDEL, and I've just listed 2 of them here. So the first exempt category of entities are manufacturers of Class 2, 3, and 4 devices, as long as they hold valid device licenses. And then the second category of exempt entities are manufacturers of Class 1 devices if they import or distribute them through an establishment that already holds an MDEL. So let's look briefly at what it takes to get each type of license. Next slide, please. To obtain a medical device license, and recall this is the license for the device itself, you have to complete an application form and pay a fee. And the amount of information which must be submitted regarding the safety and efficacy varies depending on the class of the device. Health Canada reviews the application, and if the information provided meets the requirements of the regulations, a license will be issued. And review time varies depending on the class of device, but Health Canada targets between 15 and 90 calendar days. Next slide, please. To obtain an MDEL, and recall this is for the business or the establishment, you need to complete an application form. Health Canada screens the application for completeness, and if it is complete or incomplete, an applicant is given 2 opportunities to correct any deficiencies. Once the application is complete, Health Canada issues an invoice for the application. An applicant has 30 days to pay the fee, and then review of the application begins after payment, and the target time is 120 days after payment of the fee. Next slide, please. The application requires the applicant to identify the activities related to the devices. So in other words, you have to specify if you're the manufacturer or the importer or the distributor. Next, please. So establishment licensing is designed to ensure that Health Canada is aware of the identity of establishments that are selling, importing, or manufacturing devices. And importantly, the application requires an attestation from a senior official of the establishment that medical devices sold or imported into Canada meet the safety requirements set out in the regulations, and that regulatory procedures related to post-production activities are in place to protect Canadians should a problem arise. The MDEL is issued by Health Canada on the basis of this attestation. So it's got to be true, and upon inspection, MDEL holders must be able to prove to Health Canada that they meet all of the regulatory requirements they attested to having in place. So next slide, please. That's a very brief outline of how the system works generally, and as you could see from the timelines, they're rather time consuming. And right now, given the shortages, time is of the essence. So Health Canada, as I mentioned, is in urgent need of medical devices related to coronavirus. These include personal protective gear, which are classified as Class 1 medical devices. So you can see on this slide the goggles, the respirator mask, and the gown. Next slide. And Canada is also in urgent need of COVID-19 test kits, which are typically classified as Class 3 devices. Next slide, please. Health Canada is speeding up the importation and sale of a new category of device, which is called COVID-19 medical devices. And they are defined as any device that is manufactured, sold, or represented for use in relation to the coronavirus. On March 18th, 2020, the Minister of Health approved an interim order to expedite the review of COVID-19 medical devices to authorize their importation and sale. And Health Canada has described the interim order as one of the fastest mechanisms available to address large-scale public health emergencies. And the goal of this interim order is to allow Health Canada to review all COVID-19 related applications quickly without compromising patient safety. Next slide, please. So the interim order is designed to remove impediments for manufacturers of COVID-19 devices. For example, this means that under the interim order, manufacturers need only submit an abbreviated application form to support safety, efficacy, and quality of their device. And all fees associated with the application process are waived. Next slide, please. The interim order provides an expedited authorization path for 3 types of devices. So the first type would be new COVID medical devices that are not yet licensed in Canada or any other jurisdictions. Devices that are already licensed in Canada, but not for COVID-related uses. And then the third type would be COVID-19 medical devices that are authorized by a foreign regulatory authority, such as one in China. Next slide, please. Now, an application for the authorization of importation or sale of a COVID-19 medical device must contain sufficient information to enable Health Canada to determine whether to issue authorization. And on this slide, we've outlined just some of the information that's necessary. Next slide, please. More information, as makes sense, is required for Class 3 and Class 4 devices. The application need not contain information that we've outlined in red if the applicant can demonstrate that a COVID-19 medical device is already authorized by a foreign regulatory authority. Next slide. It's important to note that even under the abbreviated application form, the applicant must attest to post-market oversight. So in other words, the applicant must attest that documented procedures are in place concerning distribution records, complaint handling, incident reporting, and recalls. If the information provided in the abbreviated application form is deemed insufficient to render a decision on whether to grant authorization, Health Canada may request additional information such as samples. Next slide, please. An authorization will only be granted if Health Canada determines that there is a public health need for the device and has concluded that the applicant provided sufficient information to support the benefits of the device and that those benefits outweigh any risks. If authorization is granted, the manufacturer may import or sell their COVID medical device in Canada. Each shipment of the COVID medical device must be accompanied with a copy of the authorization. And the authorization is only valid as long as the interim order is in effect. Health Canada has placed a 1-year time period on the interim order, but it is subject to renewal depending on the public health need. And then last slide. Due to the nature of the application and the expedited authorization, Health Canada may impose terms and conditions on authorization, cancel the authorization if the benefits no longer outweigh the risks, or the foreign authority cancels or suspends authorization. All in, Health Canada is trying to authorize COVID-19 medical devices between 5 to 20 calendar days. And as I mentioned at the top of the call, what was really interesting when all of those headlines broke is we were contacted by clients who were manufacturers and not in the medical device field, but because they were in manufacturing, they had connections with manufacturers in China who were making medical devices specifically for the COVID-19 crisis. And so we've worked with them to apply to get this fast-track authorization. And what's interesting is because these manufacturers are not versed in medical devices and don't have the post-market procedures are in place, which are so important, there are agencies that we've been able to find and hook them up with that do have the oversight and do have the establishment licenses and will lease them out, as it were, to provide the oversight necessary. So that's all I wanted to say about medical devices. I'll turn it over to Anna so she can talk about what Health Canada is doing for sanitizers and disinfectants.
Anna, we'll pass it on to you. I've unmuted your mic. And my apologies to the attendees for that slip of the slides there. Thank you for your patience with that. So on to you, Anna.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll be speaking about Health Canada's initiatives with respect to hand sanitizers and disinfectants. Next slide, please. So there have been many news reports about the growing shortages of sanitizer and disinfectant products across Canada, especially with manufacturers of these products struggling to keep up with the growing demand in view of the pandemic. Health Canada has taken a number of steps to fast-track the approval of these products for manufacture, sale, and importation into Canada. And before getting into these initiatives in detail, I wanted to look a little bit at how sanitizers and disinfectants are generally regulated in Canada. Next slide, please. So in Canada, chemical products used on surfaces and objects are regulated according to their represented use or purpose. This means that the presence or concentration of a recognized antimicrobial active ingredient as part of a product's formulation does not necessarily dictate how it's regulated. In general, there are two key factors that determine the regulatory framework that's applicable. First, it's the intended use as represented by the claims on the label of the product. And second, it's the type of surface or object to which it's intended to be applied. Next slide, please. So what this means is that a chemical product claiming antimicrobial activity on its label could be regulated as a sanitizer or a disinfectant, depending on the expressed or implied level of antimicrobial activity. Whereas if the same chemical product did not make an express antimicrobial claim on its label, it would be regulated as a cleaner. Next slide, please. So for clarity, Health Canada distinguishes cleaners, disinfectants, and sanitizers based on the following definitions. A cleaner is a substance or a mixture of substances that physically removes foreign material from surfaces and objects due to the detergent or enzymatic properties of the formulation. A disinfectant is a substance capable of destroying or inactivating pathogenic microorganisms present on the surface and the objects due to the antimicrobial action or the active ingredients present in the product. And sanitizers, they're a substance that reduce the bacterial population on surfaces and objects due to the antimicrobial action of the active ingredients. Next slide, please. Most chemical products represented for use in Canada as disinfectants on surfaces and objects, or represented for use to reprocess non-critical medical devices, are regulated by Health Canada as non-prescription drugs under the Food and Drugs Act. Disinfectant drugs require a pre-market assessment and assignment of a drug identification number, or a DIN, prior to being sold in Canada. Pre-market assessment may require evaluation of the efficacy of the drug, the safety, and the quality. The extent of the pre-market assessment is based on the relative risk associated with the use of the product, which varies depending on the knowledge of the active ingredient and the intended use of the product. Market authorization requires draft labeling, which also has to comply with the Food and Drugs Act and regulations. For a drug identification number to be issued for a disinfectant regulated as a drug, the product must be established by the Natural and Non-Prescription Health Products Directorate to be safe and effective for its intended use. Next slide, please. A drug establishment license, or a DEL, is required for any person in Canada who is fabricating, packaging, labeling, importing, distributing, or wholesaling a drug. The holder of an establishment license must ensure that the licensable activities are being conducted in compliance with good manufacturing practices, or GMPs. And compliance with GMP includes mandatory declaration of the manufacturing process of a drug, record keeping, maintaining drugs expiration dates, and continuing a stability program. Next slide, please. Now, interestingly, fabricators, packagers, distributors, and importers of disinfectants that are labeled for use on non-critical medical devices, surfaces, and inanimate objects are not required to obtain an establishment license or meet GMP compliance requirements. They're still expected to meet the provisions of Section 8 of the Food and Drugs Act, which denotes that there's a prohibition on selling drugs manufactured under unsanitary conditions or that have been adulterated in some shape or form. Health Canada does provide a standard guidance to meet requirements of Section 8 of the Act, but this guidance is voluntary. Next slide, please. Now, moving on to the regulatory framework that governs alcohol-based hand sanitizers containing ethanol and isopropanol. These products are considered to be natural health products, or NHPs, by Health Canada. So product license represented by a natural product number would be needed to legally distribute alcohol-based hand sanitizers, which includes also donation as well as sale of these products. A site license, or an SL, is required to manufacture, package, label, or import alcohol-based hand sanitizers in Canada. The holder of a site license must ensure that the licensable activities are being conducted in compliance with good manufacturing practices. Next slide, please. So in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Government of Canada has sought out Canadian manufacturers and businesses to assist with the shortages of medical supplies, including sanitizers and disinfectants. And as part of Health Canada's initiatives to respond to the growing demands of hand sanitizers and disinfectants, it has allowed for an expedited review of certain licenses. Next slide, please. Thank you. Under the expedited review process, domestic companies that do not currently have an establishment license or a site license to conduct activities related to hand sanitizers and disinfectants may submit an application for expedited review to Health Canada. Also, domestic companies that do not currently have a DIN or an MPN for a disinfectant or a hand sanitizer may submit application again for an expedited review. And Health Canada is also asking importers who currently do have an establishment license or a site license to conduct activities related to hand sanitizers and disinfectants to notify them if they will be importing these products, and also asking them to maintain records that will facilitate any post-market authorization that's needed. Next slide, please. So as you will see from this slide, the expedited process has allowed various distilleries and breweries across Canada to use their facilities and high-proof alcohol to make and distribute hand sanitizer products. There are many examples of distilleries that are currently using their equipment in order to address the shortages in hand sanitizers and are supplying these products within their communities. Next slide, please. So with respect to hand sanitizers, one of Health Canada's interim approaches is it allows products that strictly comply with a monograph entitled Antiseptic Skin Cleanser for Personal Domestic Use, which basically sets out pre-cleared information about an ingredient or product, including unacceptable uses. And it supports the licensing for alcohol-based hand sanitizers with a final concentration of 60 to 80% ethanol or 60 to 75% isopropanol. And applications that do go beyond the parameters of the monograph are not currently eligible for this expedited licensing process. Let me just, next slide, please. So with respect to applications that comply with this monograph, Health Canada aims to issue site licenses and product licenses within 24 hours of receiving the applications. And to determine whether a business needs a product license or a site license, it should consider what activities the business is currently doing and which activities it wishes to undertake. So for instance, if you do not currently manufacture, package, label, and or import alcohol-based hand sanitizers, and you intend to manufacture and distribute such products, you must apply for both a site license and a product license. Now, if you intend to only manufacture, package, label, and or import alcohol-based hand sanitizers on behalf of another company, you need to apply for a site license only. If you intend to only distribute alcohol-based hand sanitizers made by another company, you need to apply for a product license. And if you already hold a site license for manufacturing, packaging, labeling, and or importing a natural health product, and you're adding to that an alcohol-based hand sanitizer, which you intend to distribute, you would need to apply for a product license only in this instance. Next slide, please. Now, it should also be noted that the application process for the site license or product license has been simplified under the interim approach by Health Canada. So for the site license applications, certain GMP requirements have been waived by Health Canada. So for instance, stability testing is no longer required, quality assurance reporting is not required, and for products containing more than 50% alcohol, which basically would be all the products that would fall under the monograph, finished product testing for microbiological contaminants would not be required. With respect to product license applications, upon notifying Health Canada, if a manufacturer wishes to also expand the sale and distribution to healthcare and commercial settings, they are able to do so in these instances. However, the caveat is these products have not met the evidence requirements for higher risk uses in general healthcare settings. So the products must still be labeled for personal use only. And should a company wish to obtain approval to label their products for use by health professionals for uses such as pre-surgical scrubs or make explicit claims with respect to COVID-19, additional evidence would be needed to be submitted to Health Canada for safety and efficacy. And the expedited timeline within which the product license would be reviewed in this instance would not be applicable. Next slide, please. Under the interim approach, companies must still comply with the labeling requirements as set out in the Food and Drugs Act. Specifically, it's illegal to label, sell, or advertise a product, including hand sanitizers, in a false, misleading, or deceptive manner. Given that the product license is given out on the basis of the antiseptic skin cleansers monograph, labeling must be compliant with the product license. So this means that authorization under this monograph does not permit any specific references to COVID-19 or coronavirus. However, Health Canada is allowing more flexibility with respect to bilingual labeling and is waiving this requirement unless the product is destined to be distributed in bilingual regions. Next slide, please. Health Canada has also came out recently with a statement that they will be permitting technical grade ethanol to be used in manufacture of hand sanitizers in certain circumstances. And usually hand sanitizers require food grade ethanol. Technical grade ethanol has more impurities, including acetaldehyde, which have certain counterindications. Next slide, please. So manufacturers that will be using technical grade ethanol must provide additional information on their product labels. They'll have to indicate that technical grade ethanol is included as an ingredient. They have to be specific in terms of use and warning. So they would have to indicate that the products are intended for adult use only. They should not be used on broken or damaged skin. They should not be used by women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, and they should not be inhaled. So information on how to report any adverse reactions also should be included as well. Next slide, please. Now, with respect to hard surface disinfectants, other than the expedited licensing, Health Canada has also provided some leeway to manufacturers and distributors with respect to efficacy claims. And specifically, manufacturers and distributors can now make claims for the virus that causes COVID-19 if the disinfectants have been authorized already and labeled as broad spectrum viricides, or carried specific claims against specific non-envelope viruses or specific coronaviruses. And that is it from me. And now over to Amanda to discuss privacy considerations.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. All right. Great, thank you so much. So we're going to turn now and think a little bit about some privacy considerations. So just to start by setting the stage, most of what my talk is going to be focused on is the federal private sector legislation, which is the Protection of Personal Information in Electronic Documents Act, which is also known as PIPEDA or PIPEDA, depending on how you like to pronounce it. And so PIPEDA establishes the basic rules that govern how private sector organizations can collect, use, or disclose personal information in the course of their commercial activities in Canada. There's a carve-out for organizations who operate wholly within a province that has legislation that's deemed to be substantially similar to PIPEDA, and this is currently Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec. So if you're an organization exclusively carrying on business in those provinces, PIPEDA does not apply, and instead your collection, use, and disclosure of personal information will be subject to the particular provincial privacy legislation. So PIPEDA applies to every organization in respect of personal information that the organization collects, uses, or discloses in the course of commercial activity. And personal information is given a broad and expansive definition, and it's generally defined as information about an identifiable individual. So this is often captures more information than people think it might. So for example, this can include things like obvious information like name or biographical information, contact information, and government issued identifiers. Also things like health information, financial information, but it also can include things like tracking information, so IP address or GPS coordinates. So information about an identifiable individual just means the information has to relate to or concern a person or a subject. The information doesn't need to directly identify an individual to be about this individual. It just needs to permit or lead to the possible identification of someone. So business or company information is generally not considered personal information in Canada, and that is things like job title, work email address, or work phone number, so long as you're using that information to contact the person relating to something that relates to their job. And you can only collect, use, and disclose personal information to the extent it's required to fulfill an explicitly specified reasonable purpose. And reasonableness is an overarching standard in PIPEDA, and it applies even if the individual has consented to the collection, use, or disclosure of their personal information. So one thing that's becoming more popular in the news lately is a discussion of the use of de-identified data. So generally speaking, data that's truly de-identified is not considered personal information and is therefore not subject to privacy legislation. De-identification is the general term that is used for the process of removing personal information from a record or data set. And the point of doing this is to make it so that one individual cannot be identified, and this helps protect the privacy of individuals. It's important to note that de-identification doesn't completely eliminate the risk that a person could be re-identified. However, when done correctly, it does significantly reduce the risk. And the amount of de-identification that needs to be applied to a data set is to be determined on a case-by-case basis and depends on factors like how many subjects are in the data set, how likely it is that somebody could attempt to re-identify the data, and what the data is being used for. So for example, if you're releasing data publicly, this would require more stringent de-identification because obviously there would be more at risk if the public was able to re-identify someone. Another important aspect to consider is consent. This is a crucial element of privacy law, and organizations have to be open and transparent about their practices, and consent needs to be obtained at the time of collection. So this can be things like express consent, which is given explicitly through a positive action, like checking an empty checkbox, or by clicking a button that says, I agree. You've probably encountered this a lot if you're downloading an app or something on your phone. You know, you have to check off the little box and say you agree to the privacy policy and terms of use. And it's important to note that consent is considered valid only if it's meaningful. So that is, if it's reasonable to expect the individual that your business activities are directed towards would be able to understand what they're consenting to. So when you're drafting your consent language and privacy policies, it's important to keep your target audience in mind and make sure that you're using language that is easily accessible and understood by the audience. Next slide, please. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was initially some concern that privacy laws would be an impediment to sharing and publicly releasing information. And recently, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, which is the federal regulator and also called the OPC, published an assessment framework which is targeted at government institutions to help guide the development of privacy impactful initiatives that relate to the effects of the pandemic. So the OPC recognizes the current public health crisis calls for a flexible and contextual application of privacy laws, but organizations must continue to operate under lawful authority and have to continue to respect the principles that are set out in PIPEDA. So the framework that the OPC released is targeted at government institutions, but it does include references to private sector organizations, and these are generally good practices to keep in mind for private organizations as well. Next slide, please. I'm going to quickly discuss some of the privacy considerations. So the first is legal authority, which means the organization has to have a clear legal basis for the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. And while the COVID-19 pandemic is rapidly evolving, its government institutions still need to ensure the proposed measures are necessary and proportionate. And in this instance, the OPC thinks that means evidence or science-based and necessary for a specific identified purpose. So similarly, the personal information should only be used for the purpose for which it was collected. So in this context, it means personal information collected for the purpose of protecting public health should not then be used or disclosed for any other government or commercial purpose. And like I mentioned, de-identification is a helpful safeguarding measure. So the framework encourages the use of de-identified or aggregated data whenever possible. Like I mentioned, information that's truly de-identified is not considered personal information. And the framework also notes some unique challenges associated with location data, specifically that even if you've de-identified someone but associated that information with a location data point, this can lead to the re-identification of an individual. And this can be particularly risky because location data can pinpoint where somebody's home or work is and their routine behaviors. You know, for example, if they're traveling between certain locations, this can give an indication of what time they're out of their house, where their house might be. So that's something important to keep in mind if you're using location data. Another point in the framework is to consider how information could have a disproportionate impact on a vulnerable population. This can be particularly important for organizations who are making use of artificial intelligence because you'll want to make sure you're taking steps to help reduce the introduction of bias to your AI algorithm. Openness and transparency are also cornerstones of privacy legislation. Individuals must be informed of the purpose of the collection of their personal information. This goes towards collecting meaningful consent. The framework also discusses open data. So there have been a lot of pieces written about the importance of making data publicly available, but the framework says this should be done within reason and by making use of de-identified data. And again, before releasing public data sets, the benefits and risks should be carefully assessed, because there is, like I mentioned, still a risk that de-identified data could be re-identified. So this assessment needs to be context specific and should consider whether there's any particular risks or disproportionate impacts that could arise on subsets of the population. An organization is responsible for the personal information under its control, so it needs to remain accountable and have institutional safeguards that continue to be of importance during a time of a crisis. And then finally, time limitation. Generally, personal information should not be retained indefinitely. And this includes information collected in an emergency situation. And again, this goes back to making sure you're following the purpose of why it's collected. So if you are collecting the information for an emergency situation, it should be destroyed when the crisis ends. And any privacy invasive measures should be time limited and should stop when they're no longer required. Next slide, please. So the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada is not the only regulator who's written on this topic. Most of the federal and provincial privacy commissioners have published guidance noting that it is important that complete and accurate information be able to flow during a crisis, and this can still be permitted even while abiding by privacy legislation. So, for example, the Privacy Commissioner of Newfoundland and Labrador urged people to not let privacy considerations put health at risk, and it notes that its provincial legislation includes provisions that allow for disclosure in emergencies or when public interest trumps the protection of privacy. Similarly, the Privacy Commissioner's Office of Alberta released a statement about privacy in a pandemic, which also stresses the importance of making sure that public bodies, health custodians, as well as private sector organizations know how personal or health information could be shared during a pandemic or emergency situation. And then finally, I've included some examples on the screen. From PIPEDA, the OPC guidance has included some examples of how it thinks exceptions to disclosure with consent could be applicable in a pandemic. So, for example, if the consent of an individual cannot be obtained in a timely way and the individual is in an emergency situation, or where there's a disclosure required by law, and this could potentially include a public health authority. Next slide, please. So you may have read about some of the public health initiatives that are being developed to assist with the tracking and response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in April, the Ontario government, in consultation with the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, announced they are developing a new health data platform called the Pandemic Threat Response, or PANTHR, which is a new platform that will hold secure health data to allow research to better support health system planning and responsiveness, including in response to the immediate need to analyze the current COVID-19 outbreak. The platform will gather de-identified data from publicly funded administrative health service records, like physicians' claims to OHIP, drug claims submitted to the Ontario Drug Benefit Program, and discharge summaries of hospital stays and emergency department visits. So this information was previously contained in silos, so the hope is that by integrating this data, it'll help researchers with modeling, like discovering risk factors or predicting when and where these type of outbreaks may occur. And the Deputy Premier and Minister of Health noted that while access to data is important, we are all taking measures to ensure patient privacy is always respected. So again, they're showing that personal information is being kept top of mind. And similarly, Google and Apple have recently announced that they would partner to develop Bluetooth technology to help government and health agencies reduce the spread of COVID-19 through contact tracing. And many public health officials around the world believe that contact tracing is critical to combating the pandemic. So in simple terms, the technology would work by having an individual voluntarily download an app from a government or health agency onto their phone. And then through Bluetooth, the app will keep track of all the other phones the user's phone has been near throughout the day. So each participating phone will continually broadcast Bluetooth beacons, which change frequently, as this helps to maintain anonymity, and they are derived from a cryptographic key. So at the same time, the participating phone will constantly monitor the phones around them and record the codes of any other phones they encounter within a certain range and time. If a participating individual is positively diagnosed with COVID-19, and if he chooses to do so, he can enter that information in the app, which then uploads the cryptographic keys that were used to generate beacons over the last 2 weeks to a server. And then if one of the other users of the app match with an infected user, meaning they were near that affected individual, they will receive an alert that they may have been exposed. The alert will not disclose who or where the contact occurred, and the entire system is decentralized and opt-in, which are privacy-friendly settings. If the infected individual does not disclose their positive COVID-19 test through the app, then all others who are in contact with him will obviously not get an alert. So contact tracing does raise privacy concerns. However, Google and Apple have stated that privacy and transparency are at the forefront of this initiative, and the initiative is being created with privacy by design in mind. So the privacy by design framework or principles state that privacy must be proactive, meaning you are designing your product or service with privacy in mind at every step and are not reactive. And the concept is also premised on the principle that privacy is the default setting, which seeks to deliver maximum privacy protection even if the individual doesn't do anything. So this initiative has been largely praised for its privacy-conscious approach, but it's not without criticism. So for example, this initiative relies on individual self-reporting, which they may not do. There's also the potential for false positives, someone incorrectly self-diagnosing, or as we've seen with Zoom and other video conferencing, there's potential for users trolling or spamming the system. And further, there have been reports that as many as 2.5 billion phone users may not be able to use these apps, either because of geographic restrictions. So for example, China has banned Google software and services in its country, or because their devices are outdated or incompatible. And it's important to note that Google and Apple are not creating the actual apps, but are rather helping the public health agency create the apps. So this does create further questions like, does the owner of the app able to override any individual's decision in order to combat a greater public health risk? So it remains to be seen how these initiatives plan out, but it is clear that personal information and privacy are playing a major role in how these are being designed. Next slide, please. So if we turn to a more topic that impacts many of us personally, a lot of us are using video conferencing software to keep in touch with colleagues, friends, and loved ones while practicing social distancing. And I'm sure you've all seen the hilarious and often embarrassing examples of Zoom fails or video conferencing gone wrong. On screen is one of my favorite examples, a boss who somehow turned herself into a potato during a meeting and couldn't figure out how to turn it back off. Next slide, please. So the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada has chimed in on some tips for individuals using video conferencing software at home. So I thought I would share some of those with you for something to keep in mind when you are using video conferencing. So one is to be aware of what software you're using. So we've all heard the stories of Zoom bombing or people dropping into video conferences uninvited to share obscene or hateful content. So a good idea is to listen to the news or read articles about the platform you've selected, because often these type of security issues or bugs are reported in the news. And while I appreciate people don't always want to take the time to read privacy policies or terms of use, I do recommend you take a look so you can understand how the software collects and uses your information, and to make sure there's no hidden surprises about what will happen to your data or who it could be shared with. Good general security practices include using a unique password for any new accounts. So if you create a new account for video conferencing, make sure you're not reusing the same password that you're using for another critical service, like your email or something you wouldn't want someone to be able to access easily. Similarly, don't post your details on social media. Use the security features of the platform, like having it password protected, using a waiting room, disabling the ability to invite others. And make sure the version of the platform you're using is up to date so you can benefit from any patches and bug fixes. Next slide, please. This one's important. Be mindful of your surroundings and any personal information shared during a call. So I have two tweets up there. One says, my wife was doing a webcast for her pre-K class, but YouTube shut it down for copyright infringement because I was watching WrestleMania 6 in the background. And the other one says, I'm in a working from home meeting and my Google Home just answered a question someone on the video call asked unprompted. I nearly jumped out of my skin. So as you can see, it's important to be careful what's around you. So for example, check what's in the background, including what's visible on surfaces and including if there's any reflective surfaces or objects around you that may show objects you didn't intend to have in frame. Also make sure that there's no personal information that's laying out. So for example, if you're in your home office and you also use this as a place to put, bills or personal documents, you may want to clear that off your desk before starting a video conference. And it's not just what is visible in the shot, but also think about who can hear what you're saying, either through the call or in the, if you're in a house or in a space where other people can hear you. Be careful about what personal information you disclose. And finally, if you have a smart home assistant, like one of the examples with the Google Home, consider deactivating it or moving it away from it. This just helps to make sure you don't accidentally trigger it, which would start it for recording your conversation. And that's it for me.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much to Jennifer, Amanda, and Anna for a wonderful presentation. So we have until 3 o'clock for this time. We just added some time at the end of the hour. Usually these are about an hour long for questions. I haven't seen any questions come through just yet. I'll give you a few minutes if anybody has any questions for Amanda, Jennifer, or Anna. I'm happy to ask them on your behalf, so please use the Q&A. If there are no questions, we will close out a little bit early. Just so you know, we usually try to make these resources available after the fact to our clients. And we have created a resource page around COVID-19 resources, services, slide decks on our website. So please take a moment to visit that and have a look through and see if there's anything that could be helpful to you. And please reach out as needed to follow up with us on this presentation if you'd like. And any questions you may have, we're happy to arrange any calls or any follow-ups. If you have further questions that come to you after this session, we're happy to facilitate some connections there. So I don't see anything popping through, so that's okay. No questions is okay. People need some time to digest. So I would like to thank Bereskin Parr for continuing to support Innovation Factory and our efforts in helping you. We really appreciate all the work that they've put into this presentation and in this presentation today, that we had so many willing to join us and visit. And thank you to the attendees for taking part. We hope that this was useful, and we'd love your feedback. If you have any, you can contact me directly via my email, Bridget Heward at innovationfactory.com. So that's BRIGITTE.HUARD at innovationfactory.com. You can find me on LinkedIn too, if we're not already friends on there. So thanks again to everybody. I will close it out as there doesn't seem to be any questions. And again, thank you to everybody for joining today. Really appreciate it. Oh, so, and right as I'm closing out, there's a question. All right, so we'll see if we can answer it live. So from Apurva and Anthony Yadav, so their question is, our product is technically a disinfection device for UVC, and therefore would be under FDA, but it is a medical device that performs the disinfection. So where would it be classified? Now, is there anybody who wants to answer that question out of the folks that we have here? Let me know. I will unmute our speakers. Let's see. Okay, we've got a couple more. Okay, so Apurva also is asking Health Canada, MDL, or FDA? Let's see.
Information, I don't know the answer off the top of my head. What's a FAR UVC? So it's a light that performs the disinfectant? If yes, that sounds like it would be a device.
Okay, so let's see, Apurva, let's see if I can. Okay. Can you see the question in the Q&A there? Was it Anna or that answered, or Jennifer?
I answered the one about the FAR UVC, which appears to be a device if the disinfection is achieved through light, which is what it sounds like.
Okay, yeah. So FAR UVC. Apurva, could you specify if it's a light device? In the question? Okay. Human safe UVC, ultraviolet light, yes.
Yeah, so that sounds to me it would be a device.
So Health Canada, MDL, or FDA was her follow-up.
Well, so if you want to go under the fast track procedures, I assume you mean the Food and Drug Administration. If it has been approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the US, that is one of the categories of devices that can be fast tracked, because it seems from our experience that Health Canada is processing fairly quickly those devices that have received approval from another government agency outside of Canada.
Okay.
In terms of Francis's question.
So I'll read it out just so that
Oh, sure.
you can't see it. So Francis is asking, can you expand on the licensing requirements? How detailed must the procedures for distribution, complaint, recall be? And do these procedures have to be submitted during application or required to be presented during the audit?
So under the fast track, I assume that's what Francis is talking about. And it's the attestation that's important. So as mentioned, we're working with a client who is not in the medical device field and is not equipped to provide those procedures. So they're working with an agency that can provide that oversight and will have the necessary detail if there is an audit. But during the fast track approval process, we did not provide a lot of detail. It was, as we said, it's the attestation that's critical because it has to be a true statement that those procedures exist.
Okay. Okay, and I noticed that there was a follow-up you mentioned. Okay, he says, okay, thanks. Wonderful. Okay, glad to have answered your question. Okay. Any other questions so far? Feel free to populate them in the Q&A.
Just something of interest while we were on the phone. The Competition Bureau put out a news release warning companies that are making false or misleading claims about the treatment, prevention, or cure of COVID-19, because obviously none of those exist right now.
Okay, and I think Francis is writing something else out. Catherine Vardy is asking if the slides will be available. So typically, as I mentioned before, we make the slides available when presenters share them with us. So I'm happy to share them via our website is where we are putting all the resources right now. Okay, so I've answered that one live. So Francis had a question. So he said, sorry, follow up. So disinfectant. So you talked about chemical disinfectants, but how about physical disinfectants? Are they considered medical devices or only if they are used on medical devices? I hope I understood that question properly there. Sorry. Feel free to elaborate, Francis, as needed.
No, I think a physical disinfectant would be a device.
Okay. Okay, and then device. And then, i.e. UV sterilizers being used on PPE versus UV sterilizers used in hallways or healthcare facilities.
I think both of those would be devices. I don't think that's a distinction that would change the classification.
Okay. Okay. Does that satisfy your question, Francis? Okay. So type 2 to 4 medical device?
Oh, that I couldn't. I mean, I would be hazarding a guess.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly 2.
Okay. Okay, so that one we'd have to check in on for you, Francis.
There's some, as I said, you have to go through Schedule 1 of the regulations and really apply the rules to figure out.
And he says MDEL versus MDL is what I'm implying.
Well, so the type of license you need depends on your activity. So if you're a manufacturer of a physical disinfecting device, you would, and it's class 2 or higher, you would need a license for the device itself. If you're an importer or a distributor of one of those classes, you need an MDEL.
Okay. Okay, that's great. Did that answer your question? Okay, that answered his questions. Okay, wonderful. Okay, glad we could help, Francis. Thanks for the smiley face. Always appreciated. All right, any other questions from the group? Open. Okay, so he says, okay, thanks. Doesn't look like there's any more questions. Okay. So I think we're going to wrap it up for the session today. But thank you for all your questions, and certainly I know that if any additional ones come up, that may very well happen. So feel free to connect with us. We're happy to connect you to Bereskin Parr and any of our facilitators and mentors as well at Innovation Factories. So please do feel free to connect if you have further questions related to this. We are happy to make connections wherever we can.